Ha, ha. Shields and swords, feel the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Hello, minions. A lot of people have been requesting that I address a particular issue, and that has to do with Beowulf comic books. Some of you know that back in November, I did a kind of stunt writing thing where I essentially tried to write an entire academic book in a month, which I managed to do. I do not recommend to you that you try that. It was a nightmare, but I got it done, and the book is tentatively entitled Beowulf Illuminated, and it is about Beowulf comic books. And so a lot of people have asked me to talk a little bit about that here in advance of the book being released. It hasn't been sent to publisher yet. I'm still, I'm still editing it, etc. Hope to get it edited in a few weeks' time, but we will see if I run into some sort of nasty problems. Mostly the problems of editing in this case have to do with a few details have to be fleshed out. Citations, I wasn't certain how to properly do comic book citations, so I have to go back through and redo all the citations properly. And then also, in the interim, while I was working on it, I ended up being able to interview several comic book creators. And in some of those interviews, they said things to me that caused me to rethink things I had already written, or think that they need to be recast in some way. So I have to go back and make some real substantive revisions to a few sections based on what those interviews told me. But in any case, it's in probably 90% of its final form, and so. So I have given this actually a lot of thought, this subject. And so two things I want to get out of the way. First of all, it's actually a little hard to say what's a Beowulf comic or Beowulf graphic novel. Some things are obviously so. I mean, the one we're talking about today, the DC Comics, very clearly this is a Beowulf-themed comic book. There are other issues where sometimes it's hard to tell because some things seem more like illustrated editions. There isn't so much interplay between the text and the images, and so causes me to be, in a couple cases, uncertain, is that an illustrated version of Beowulf, or is that a comic book? And sometimes I'm myself not clear on it. And then in other cases, sometimes you'll have the name Beowulf or a name like Grendel used, and yet when you start to look at the content of it, sometimes it's not set in the Middle Ages, sometimes it's a character named Beowulf who's Beowulfish, etc. So I really chose only to keep my focus on ones where I was very confident saying, this is a Beowulf comic book. And there'll be some other things which people might say, oh, this... I would include this, or I would include that, and when it was questionable, I left it out. The other thing is that there isn't a tradition of Beowulf comics, and in the current structure of my book, the comic books are not laid out in chronological order, and the reason for that is I don't want to create a false sense that there is a tradition. In most cases, the comic book artists I talked to literally looked at no other, or maybe one other, comic book or graphic novel adaptation. So it was not a thing where one picks up a Beowulf comic book and there's a kind of consciousness that the audience should already be familiar with other comic books. There is often a consciousness that you should be familiar with Beowulf, although some of them, like the one we have today, might introduce itself as maybe your first introduction to Beowulf. So, although today I'm going to talk about the earliest one, the earliest one that I looked at, I don't think that any subsequent ones, I don't want anyone to take from that they were influenced by this one. I think they really were not. They generally are not influenced by one another at all. Okay, so on to this one. This is the DC Comics Beowulf Dragon Slayer series. It begins in May of 1975 and runs until March of 76. And it is not particularly faithful to the storyline of Beowulf. Essentially what happens is in the first book, we see that Weird is set up almost as a kind of god that is opposed by Satan, and then the Beowulf story is this sort of framework between Beowulf sort of finding out about Grendel, and then ultimately, one presumes in the end, ultimately slaying Grendel, in order to introduce a whole bunch of other literary works in some way. And those literary works are also introduced in an extremely, like a lot of liberties are taken. So we have lots of them. The Slave Maid of Satan has references to the Odyssey, very strong references to the Odyssey. We've got the Minotaur. Dracula is a major character in these. We've got references to Chariots of the Gods, references to Gilgamesh or other sorts of ancient Sumerian literature. The legends such as the lost tribes of Israel. These kinds of things are all part of this world that they created, and so there's a lot of craziness in it. I've often said that in one of these issues is my favorite single page of any comic book ever, and it's where Beowulf and his Amazon girlfriend, he takes a laser, shoots the panel out of the spacecraft that they're on. Already you can tell, a little divergence from the original text. He and Ulysses, and this Amazonian friend crash into the volcano in the middle of Atlantis. They manage to leap out of the crashing spacecraft, I guess do a roll or something, and they're fine. The spacecraft crashing into the volcano causes it to erupt and destroy Atlantis, but they're able to go down and get to a raft quickly to get away before everyone else is killed in Atlantis. And all that happens on one page, which is just a beautiful, beautiful page of mishmash of everything that you can imagine. A lot of craziness in it, which is in part what I really love about this. Now, in 2007, for the Unlocked Word Horde, I did a series where I kind of went through this, and it's very tongue-in-cheek, where I'm kind of making fun of it. And I just want to, say here, without irony, it is definitely crazy. There's all sorts of nuts things that go on it. But even though I act like I hate it, in the sort of the tone of the 2007 series I wrote, really there's something I love a great deal about this. And one thing I love particularly is the way in which it uses a "don't throw me in the briar patch" approach to get children to read the original story of Beowulf. And I just want to give you a sense of it too. Like it doesn't. You would think, well, this doesn't go along with it very well, right? It doesn't go along with the actual storyline. But I want to read you Alan Asherman here. Mike Uslan. He has written in here at the end where the letter section would normally go, I guess, prologue at the end. I'm not sure what we'd call this, epilogue, I suppose. and I'll just read this to you, and I want to note the tone of this. Beowulf, DC doing Beowulf, but that thing's educational. An epic poem we've all had to read for junior high school English class. Don't tell me DC is doing a Classics Illustrated. No, not Classics Illustrated, but real live action and adventure stories. Okay. And so they begin with this kind of like, oh, educational, we would never do that to you. Educational's terrible. Don't worry, there's nothing educational about this. But note what Uzlan does, which is, I think, really delightful. Beowulf is the oldest surviving piece of English literature. It's an epic poem in the vein of the Odyssey and the Iliad, author unknown. It's been hailed as one of the masterpieces of the English language. It's exciting. When DC first announced its interest in developing some new titles, we searched for a subject that could not only be fast-paced comics magazine, but also have specific educational value. The field of education is the place where comics can do the most good in the years to come. And so came Beowulf, Prince of the Geats. Will the action be sacrificed for educational value? Actually, if we kept to the original educational poem, the comic book would be unbelievably gory. Grendel is no sunny sparkle. While teachers may find that unchained violence suitable in the poem, our visual interpretations must be toned down somewhat. But while DC may be lessening the amount of blood in Beowulf, we'll be adding to the legends recounted in the poem. This reminds me of an old Boy Scout leader cliche, which is that the boys will be interested in the three B's, anything that burns, bites, or bleeds. And here we have they poo-poo the idea of, oh, educational, no one wants educational. And throughout this, and I'm not going to read every part of this, but throughout this, Uzlan sort of says, well, that's because the original is so gory, so violent. The violence is so unchained. We would never show you that. And just a sort of tease throughout this. And you see he returns to this many times, this sense of that, well, the literature we're showing you, yeah, it looks actiony and adventure now, but it's even more violent and gory in the original. And even to go further than that, I just here later on in the text, we have here, don't deprive yourself anyway, read the poem. It's great. And while you're at it, we may also suggest you peruse Grendel by John Gardner. Valentine Books, 95 cents. Oh my gosh, the good old days when a book was 95 cents. Beowulf, translated by Burton Raffle, Mentor Books, 75 cents. And even Monarch Notes to Beowulf by George Quasha, $1. I actually don't know anything about those Monarch Notes. But here they actually give you publication information for this comic book, which is, clearly aimed at young boys. The price and the publisher where you can go get the original. And so, Beowulf here, we have got all sorts of exciting moments. Beowulf fighting, giant bats. There's one scene where Grendel kills Satan. I'm not making that up. Here's a wonderful depiction of Grendel here. Aside from this sort of trip down memory lane where one could learn karate from these, we have here really a sense of that Beowulf is just moving from one adventure to another, and moving from one literary adventure to another. And that in essence, the purpose of this is not really to have the reader leave this and think, oh, I've read what goes on in Beowulf, but rather to kind of tease you into reading the original, thinking there must be something even more violent or more gory in that original one. In any case, it's a beautiful start. It's a nice little series. It ends. So it's not an ongoing series. It ends with I think book 6 after 6 books. But that would be DC Comics Beowulf Dragon Slayer. So, if it turns out that people really are interested in hearing me talk about these comic books and not just a thing they want in theory, I may continue to bring in some of the other graphic novels and comic books that I've studied. But in any case, for now, that's all, minions.